In 1848, a glint of yellow in a California river started a whisper that traveled on the wind. That whisper became a global roar, forever changing a nation and the people who chased the dream. Before the roar, there was the quiet. In early 1848, California was a world away from the bustling cities of the East. It was a new American territory, recently acquired from Mexico, but it was still a land of immense, sleepy distances. Its few thousand residents were scattered across sprawling cattle ranches and small coastal towns. The great interior was a place of rolling hills, oak forests, and wild, untamed rivers, known mostly to the native peoples who had lived there for millennia. In the heart of this quiet land was a man with a grand design. His name was John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant with a checkered past and a boundless ambition. Here, in the Sacramento Valley, he was building his own private empire, a feudal paradise he called New Helvetia, or New Switzerland. His fort was a center of commerce and agriculture, a bastion of order in the wilderness. He had thousands of acres, herds of livestock, and a vision of a peaceful, prosperous future built on wheat and timber, not on chance or chaos. To expand his empire, he needed lumber. And for lumber, he needed a sawmill. The man he hired to build it was James Wilson Marshall. Marshall was a carpenter, a quiet and somewhat moody man from New Jersey. He was a decent, hard-working craftsman, not a dreamer or an adventurer. He had found his way to California and was simply trying to make a living. In late 1847, he led a small crew of workers up the South Fork of the American River, to a valley the local natives called Coloma. There they began the slow work of felling trees and constructing the mill that would supply Sutter's dream. The work was hard and the progress was slow. To deepen the channel that would power the mill's water wheel, Marshall's crew would loosen the earth during the day, and at night, they would divert the river through the channel to wash the debris away. On the morning of January 24, 1848, Marshall followed his usual routine. He shut off the water and walked down the length of the freshly scoured channel, inspecting the work. The sun was just beginning to warm the cool morning air. The only sound was the gentle murmur of the river. And then, he saw it. A flicker of light in the shallow water, resting on the bedrock. He thought it might be a piece of quartz, but it shone with a dull, buttery yellow that was different. He reached down into the cold water and picked it up. It was small, about the size of a pea, but it felt unusually heavy in his palm. He placed it on a rock and hammered it with another. A piece of quartz would have shattered. This metal just flattened. His heart began to beat a little faster. He walked further, his eyes scanning the bottom of the channel. He found another piece, then another. He showed the small flakes to his crew. They were unimpressed, laughing it off. Gold? Here? It seemed impossible. But Marshall couldn't shake the feeling. That night, in the camp's cookhouse, one of the workers, a woman named Elizabeth Wimmer, used an old folk recipe to test the metal. She dropped it into a kettle of soap she was boiling. The legend said that if it was real gold, it would emerge untarnished. The next morning, it was as bright as ever. Now certain, Marshall rode the 45 miles to Sutter's fort through a driving rain. He burst in on Sutter, drenched and agitated, asking for a private audience. In a locked room, Marshall pulled a small pouch from his pocket and poured the contents onto a table. John Sutter's heart sank. He conducted his own tests, pulling an encyclopedia from his shelf to read about the properties of gold, weighing the flakes in a scale against some silver coins. There was no doubt. It was gold of the highest quality. But this was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of dread. Both men understood immediately that this discovery was not a blessing, but a curse that would unravel everything they had built. Sutter wrote in his diary, "I was very much troubled. I knew that as soon as the gold discovery was known, all my laborers would leave me, and my agricultural enterprise, which was just beginning to flourish, would be entirely ruined. They swore everyone to secrecy. They had to keep this quiet, at least for a few more weeks, until they could get the sawmill running and their crops planted. But a secret like this is like trying to cup water in your hands. It was simply too big to hold. The workers at the mill began to prospect in their spare time, finding their own small stashes. A teamster delivering supplies saw them and carried the news back to the fort. Soon, Sutter's own workers were quietly paying for whiskey and supplies at a nearby store with pinches of gold dust. The rumor began to spread, a slow-moving current of gossip flowing down the river into the small, sleepy port town of San Francisco. The man who turned that current into a tidal wave was Samuel Brannan. Brannan was a firebrand, a newspaper publisher and a shrewd merchant who owned the main supply store near Sutter's fort. When he saw Sutter's workers paying with gold, he knew exactly what it meant. He quickly bought up every pickaxe, shovel, and pan he could find. Then, on a spring day in May of 1848, Brannan went to San Francisco to make his announcement. He didn't just print it in his paper. He ran through the streets, waving a quinine bottle full of glittering gold dust, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" The whisper was now a shout. The quiet was over. The roar was about to begin. Sutter and Marshall tried to keep the gold a secret, fearing it would destroy their community. What do you think you would have done? Kept the biggest secret in the world, or cashed in? Let me know in the comments. Samuel Brannan's shout echoed through the streets of San Francisco, and in a matter of weeks, the town was a hollowed-out shell. Every able-bodied man had dropped his tools, abandoned his shop, and headed for the hills. The news traveled next on ships, carrying letters and official reports to the east coast of the United States. By the autumn of 1848, President James K. Polk formally announced the discovery to Congress, and the rumor was now an undeniable fact. The whisper had become a national obsession. And then, it went global. The news crossed the Atlantic, printed in the papers of London, Paris, and Berlin. It sailed south, igniting a fever in the ports of Chile and Peru. It crossed the vast Pacific, reaching the shores of Australia and the villages of southern China. And with the news, an idea took root in the minds of hundreds of thousands of people, the idea of a new beginning, a chance to instantly transform one's life with a lucky strike. The gold rush had begun, and it triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history. They became known as the 49ers, though they came for years after. And they were not a single type of person. They were farmers from Missouri who sold their land for a wagon and a dream. They were doctors and lawyers from Boston who left behind comfortable lives for an adventure. They were shopkeepers from England, sailors from Australia, and peasants from China, fleeing famine and war. They were white, black, brown, and yellow. They were the hopeful and the desperate, the virtuous and the criminal, all pulled by the irresistible gravity of gold. But to get to the gold, they first had to survive the journey. And there were three main paths to California, each one a great trial of body and spirit. The first path was the sea. For those with money, the journey around the Horn seemed the most civilized option. It required no wagons, no meals, no walking. It was a single ticket from New York or Boston, straight to San Francisco. The journey was advertised as a grand ocean cruise, but the reality was a grueling passage of 5 to 8 months, covering 18,000 miles of open water. Life aboard these ships was a tedious, miserable affair. Passengers were crowded into dark, foul-smelling quarters. The food, after months at sea, became a monotonous diet of salted meat, so hard it was said you could carve it like wood, and dry, insect-infested biscuits called hardtack. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, with nothing to see but the endless gray expanse of the ocean. This crushing boredom was punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The most dreaded part of the voyage was the passage around Cape Horn, the southernmost tip of South America. It is a place where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide in a fury of wind and waves. Here, ships could be trapped for weeks, battling hurricane-force winds, mountainous waves, and freezing sleet. One passenger wrote in his diary, November 10th. For 2 weeks we have been beaten by the Horn. The ship groans like a dying beast with every wave that crashes over the deck. We cannot cook, we cannot stand, we can only lie in our bunks, wet and cold, and pray we see the morning. 2 men were washed overboard yesterday. We did not even know their names. And for those who survived the Horn, another invisible enemy waited, scurvy. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables caused the disease to rot the body from the inside out. It was a slow, agonizing death on a seemingly endless sea. For those who lacked the time or the patience for the Horn, there was the Panama shortcut. On a map, it looked so simple. Sail to the coast of Panama, cross the narrow 60-mile isthmus, and catch another ship on the Pacific side. It promised to cut the journey in half. This promise, however, was a deadly illusion. The first leg of the journey, a ship to the mouth of the Chagres River, was easy enough. But the Chagres was the gateway to a sweltering, disease-ridden jungle. Travelers would hire local guides to pull them upriver in dugout canoes, under a canopy so thick the sun rarely broke through. The air was heavy with a suffocating humidity, and the nights were filled with the sounds of unseen creatures. The real danger, however, was microscopic. This was the heart of the malaria and cholera belt. Mosquitoes carried yellow fever, and contaminated water spread cholera with terrifying speed. A man could feel perfectly healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. If you survived the jungle crossing, you arrived on the Pacific coast to find your journey had only just stalled. There were far more gold seekers arriving than there were ships to take them north. Thousands of men were stranded for weeks, sometimes months, in makeshift tent cities, waiting for a ticket on a ship, any ship, at any price. A passenger described the scene. Panama is a purgatory. We are trapped between the jungle and the sea. The heat is oppressive, the food is rotten, and every day another man is buried. We stare at the empty horizon, praying for the sight of a sail. The gold feels a world away, and many here are beginning to believe they will die on this miserable beach. The shortcut, for thousands, became the longest and last journey of their lives. The third great trial was the overland route. This is the journey of the iconic American pioneer, the path of the wagon train. It was the cheapest option, and so it was the one chosen by most. But it demanded a different kind of payment, a toll of sweat, endurance, and sheer grit. The journey began in towns like Independence, Missouri, which swelled each spring with thousands of families selling their farms and possessions, buying wagons, oxen, and supplies for the 2,000-mile trek. They set out in May, hoping to cross the mountains before the first winter snows. The first part of the journey, across the Great Plains, was deceptively beautiful. The grass was green, the pace was steady, and a spirit of adventure filled the air. But soon, the routine became a monotonous grind. Wake before dawn, yoke the oxen, walk beside the wagon through choking dust for 10 to 15 miles, make camp, and do it all again the next day. For 4 to 6 months. The dangers were constant. River crossings were treacherous, with wagons and livestock often swept away by strong currents. Accidents were common, with people, often children, falling and being crushed beneath the heavy wagon wheels. But the greatest killer on the trail, as in Panama, was disease. Cholera, spread by contaminated water sources at campsites, could sweep through a wagon train and wipe out a dozen people in a single night. It is estimated that 1 in every 10 people who started the California Trail never made it to the end. The final challenge was the Sierra Nevada mountains. After months on the trail, with their animals weakened and their supplies running low, they faced a massive wall of granite. The ascent was brutal, sometimes requiring them to unload their wagons and haul their possessions up the steep slopes piece by piece. One weary traveler captured the feeling in his journal. October 5th. The mountains. God, I had not imagined them so cruel. We have been pulling the wagon with ropes all day. My hands are raw, my body aches, and my spirit is nearly broken. We can see the summit, but it never seems to get any closer. California must be on the other side. I pray it is worth this. Each path to the goldfields was its own special kind of nightmare. Of the 3 main routes, the stormy sea, the diseased jungle, or the endless trail, which one would you have chosen? Comment with sea, jungle, or trail below. For those who survived the journey, this was the moment they had dreamed of for months. They had crossed oceans, jungles, and mountains to finally arrive in the land of gold. But the California they found was not the paradise they had imagined. It was a raw, scarred landscape, teeming with a frantic, desperate energy. The first sight of a mining camp was often a shock. There were no neat towns, no paved streets, no grand hotels. There was only mud, canvas, and chaos. They sprouted overnight in any canyon or riverbed where gold was found, and they were given names that reflected their character: Rough and Ready, Skunk Gulch, Bedbug, and most famously, Hangtown, so named for the swift and brutal justice carried out by its residents. These were not communities. They were temporary congregations of strangers, united by a single, obsessive purpose. The air was thick with the smoke of 1,000 campfires, the clang of shovels against rock, and a babble of languages from every corner of the earth. This was the new reality. The dream had been to find gold. The work was now to get it out of the ground. For the earliest arrivals in 1848 and 49, the work was deceptively simple. The gold, washed down from the mountains over millennia, was just sitting in the riverbeds. The only tool a man needed was a shovel and a simple, shallow pan. The process was a kind of meditation in hope. You would scoop a load of gravel and sand from the river bottom, submerge the pan in the water, and begin to swirl. The idea was to let the lighter material, the sand, the dirt, the pebbles, wash over the rim, while the heavier material sank to the bottom. With each careful swirl, the contents of the pan would shrink, until all that was left was a bit of black sand and, if you were lucky, a few specks of yellow. In those first months, it was said that a man could make a fortune with nothing more than a pan and a strong back. Stories, often exaggerated, told of men finding nuggets the size of their thumb, of pulling hundreds of dollars worth of gold from a single riverbed in a single day. This was the dream made real, the promise that had pulled them across the world. But this easy gold, the surface gold, did not last long. As tens of thousands of new miners flooded into the canyons, the rivers were quickly picked clean. The work had to get harder. The first step up in technology was the cradle, or rocker. It was a wooden box on rockers, like a child's cradle, with a sieve on top and riffles, small wooden bars, on the bottom. It was a 2-man job. One man would shovel dirt and gravel into the top, while his partner continuously poured buckets of water over it and rocked the cradle back and forth. The water would wash the dirt away, the larger rocks would get caught in the sieve, and the heavy gold would get trapped in the riffles at the bottom. A cradle team could process far more dirt in a day than a single man with a pan, but the work was grueling, a relentless cycle of shoveling, carrying, and rocking under the hot California sun. As the gold became even more scarce, the technology evolved again. Teams of miners would band together to build a sluice box. This was essentially a long, sloping wooden trough, sometimes hundreds of feet long, with riffles all along its bottom. The miners would divert a stream of water from the river to run through the sluice. Then, all day long, they would shovel tons of dirt and rock into the top of the box. The constant flow of water would wash everything away except for the gold, which, being the heaviest, would settle and get caught in the riffles. It was an assembly line of labor, and it was brutally effective. But it was also the beginning of the end for the individual prospector. The hunt for gold was no longer a solitary dream, it was becoming an industry. And the physical toll of this work was immense. Whether panning, rocking, or sluicing, the labor was backbreaking. Men stood for 12 hours a day, often knee-deep in water so cold it numbed their bones. The diet was poor, the work was repetitive, and the body quickly began to break down. One young man from New England wrote home to his sister, "My hands are so calloused and cracked that I can barely make a fist. My back aches in a way I never knew a back could ache. We stand in this freezing water from sunup to sundown, and at the end of the day, I crawl into my tent and fall into a sleep so deep it feels like a small death. Then the sun rises, and we do it all again. For all this, I have found barely enough gold to keep myself in beans and bacon." His letter was no exaggeration. The great, cruel irony of the gold rush was that finding gold didn't necessarily make you rich. Because in a land with a surplus of gold and a scarcity of everything else, the cost of living was astronomical. This was a world of dizzying inflation. A single egg could cost $3, the equivalent of nearly $100 today. A shovel, which cost $1 back east, sold for 50. A barrel of flour could cost more than the average man made in a year. Miners would toil for a week to gather an ounce of gold dust, worth about $16, only to see it all disappear in a single trip to the supply tent for a few pounds of flour, some salted pork, and a new pair of boots. They were trapped in a cycle of hard labor and high expenses, constantly chasing a fortune that remained just out of reach. The workday was brutal, but for many, the evenings were worse. This was a society composed almost entirely of young men, thousands of miles from their homes, their families, their wives. It was a world starved of comfort, of softness, of the civilizing influence of community. The loneliness was a palpable thing, a constant ache that was even heavier than the physical exhaustion. To combat it, the miners turned to the only comforts available: whiskey and gambling. Every camp had dozens of makeshift saloons where, for a pinch of gold dust, a man could buy a glass of cheap, potent liquor. Card games ran all night, with fortunes won and lost on the turn of a single card. These tents were filled with a desperate, volatile energy, and arguments, often over a disputed claim or a card game, were frequently settled with a knife or a pistol. There was no law, no police, only a rough and often brutal system of miners' justice. Yet, for all the violence, the greatest danger in the camps was not a bullet or a blade. It was disease. The camps were filthy, with no sanitation to speak of. The miners' diet was appalling, often consisting of nothing more than salted meat, hard biscuits, and coffee. Fresh vegetables and fruit were almost non-existent. This lack of vitamin C led to the return of an old sailor's disease, scurvy. A man's gums would rot, his teeth would fall out, and old wounds would reopen. Even more deadly were the waterborne illnesses. With thousands of men living and working along the rivers, the water sources became open sewers, breeding grounds for dysentery and cholera. These diseases could sweep through a camp with the speed and ferocity of a wildfire, killing dozens in a matter of days. The dream of gold was so powerful, but the reality was that a man was far more likely to die of sickness in a dirty tent than he was to strike it rich. The dream was finding a nugget the size of your fist, but the reality was spending a fortune on bacon and beans. What modern-day get-rich-quick scheme does the gold rush remind you of? Share your thoughts in the comments. In the chaotic world of the gold fields, a strange and powerful truth began to emerge. The men who were getting truly, lastingly rich were not the ones with the shovels, but the ones who sold the shovels. While thousands of prospectors broke their backs in the icy rivers for a few dollars a day, a new class of entrepreneur was quietly building fortunes by mining the miners. They understood a simple economic principle. In a gold rush, the demand for goods and services is the only sure bet. No one understood this better than Samuel Brannan, the man who had first shouted the news of gold in the streets of San Francisco. His timing was no accident. Before he made his famous announcement, he had bought up every pick, pan, and shovel in the region. He established a chain of supply stores between San Francisco and the gold fields, effectively creating a monopoly on the miners' needs. He sold shovels that cost him 20 cents for $10 or $15 apiece. By controlling the flow of supplies, Brannan was making thousands of dollars a day, far more than any prospector. He quickly became California's first millionaire, a fortune built not on finding gold, but on the hopes of those who did. Another of these savvy merchants was a young Bavarian immigrant named Levi Strauss. He arrived in San Francisco in 1853, not with a pickaxe, but with a stock of dry goods to sell. He noticed the miners' constant complaint: their pants, made of ordinary cotton, would fall apart after just a few weeks of the rough work. Strauss had an idea. He took the tough canvas material he had intended for tents and wagon covers and had a tailor fashion it into simple, durable work trousers. They were an instant success. He later improved the design, switching to a heavy blue denim from France called serge denim, hence denim, and adding copper rivets to the pockets to keep them from tearing. He had created an icon. Levi Strauss never panned for a single ounce of gold, but he built an empire that would outlast all the gold mines in California. And they were not alone. The Studebaker brothers got their start making wheelbarrows for miners before building a famous automobile company. Philip Armour, who would later found a meat-packing empire, ran a butcher shop in the gold fields. The real, sustainable wealth of the gold rush flowed not from the rivers, but into the pockets of the merchants, the bankers, the shippers, and the saloon keepers who understood that the most valuable mine was the miners' own pockets. But beneath this story of clever enterprise, a much darker story was unfolding, a story of what the gold rush cost, and who was forced to pay the price. The land the 49ers flooded into was not empty. It was home to more than 150,000 native people, a diverse tapestry of tribes and cultures who had lived in balance with this land for 10,000 years. They were the Miwok, the Maidu, the Pomo, and dozens of other nations. The arrival of 300,000 prospectors in the space of a few years was not a rush. It was an apocalypse. The first wave of destruction was invisible. The miners brought with them diseases like smallpox and measles, to which the native population had no immunity. Sickness swept through their villages, killing thousands. The second wave was starvation. The miners' activities choked the salmon-filled rivers with mud and gravel, destroying the primary food source for many tribes. The vast herds of cattle and sheep brought by the newcomers devoured the grasses and roots that the native people relied on. The game they hunted was driven away by the noise and chaos. The final wave was one of brutal, calculated violence. The miners saw the native people as obstacles, as diggers, who were in the way of the gold. Posses of armed men, self-proclaimed Indian fighters, raided villages, murdering men, women, and children. This was not random violence. It was a state-sanctioned policy of extermination. The new California state government paid bounties for the scalps and heads of Native Americans. In just over 2 decades, from the start of the gold rush to 1870, the native population of California plummeted from 150,000 to just 30,000. It was a genocide, fueled by greed and racism, and it is the darkest secret of the gold rush. This shadow of racism extended to nearly everyone who was not a white American. The promise of gold was supposed to be for all, but in reality, it was for a select few. Experienced miners from Mexico, Chile, and Peru were among the first to arrive, and their skill and success bred a bitter resentment among the white prospectors. To drive them out, the California legislature passed the foreign miners' tax in 1850. It imposed a crippling fee of $20 a month, an impossible sum for most, on any miner who was not a U.S. citizen. It was a tool of economic expulsion, and it worked. Thousands of Latin American miners were forced to abandon their claims and return home. The tax was also used to target the thousands of Chinese immigrants who arrived, hoping to escape the poverty and war of their homeland. They came to California as sojourners, planning to work hard, save money, and return to their families. They were incredibly industrious, often working together to extract gold from claims that others had declared empty. But they were met with suspicion and open hostility. They were beaten, robbed, and murdered, with little recourse to the law. One Chinese miner wrote of his experience. "We are seen as a people to be reviled. They curse us and stone us. They will not let us work in the rich ground, so we must scratch at the edges. We live in fear, but we endure, for the thought of our families at home gives us strength." The gold rush did not build a land of equal opportunity. It built a society on a strict racial hierarchy. The final shadow cast by gold was upon the land itself. As the surface gold disappeared, the methods of extraction became more desperate and destructive. The ultimate expression of this was a new technique called hydraulic mining. It was a form of warfare against the earth. Miners would construct complex networks of dams, reservoirs, and canals to channel water to a single point. There, the water was fed into a giant iron nozzle called a monitor, which could fire a jet of water with such force it could toss 1,000-pound boulders around like pebbles. They aimed these water cannons at the ancient, gold-bearing hillsides, and simply washed them away. Entire mountains were liquefied, blasted into a slurry of mud, gravel, and rock, which was then directed through enormous sluice boxes to capture the gold. The leftover debris, a thick, toxic sludge called slickens, was simply dumped into the nearest river. The environmental consequences were catastrophic. Rivers that had once run clear were now choked with billions of cubic yards of sediment. Riverbeds were raised by as much as 100 feet, causing devastating floods downstream that destroyed farms and entire towns. The city of Sacramento was buried under several feet of mud. Mercury, which was used in the sluices to bind with the fine gold particles, was washed into the river systems by the ton, poisoning the water, the fish, and the land for more than a century to come. The miners had come to find the treasure of the earth, and in their frenzy, they had inflicted wounds on the landscape that would never fully heal. The story of the gold rush is often told as a tale of adventure, but for the native people and many foreign miners, it was an invasion. Was this darker side of the story something you were taught in school? I'm genuinely curious to read your experiences. And as these darker realities took hold, the original dream of the 49er was already beginning to fade. By the mid-1850s, the character of the goldfields had changed completely. The lone prospector, the hopeful 49er with his simple pan and cradle, was becoming a relic of the past. The easy gold, the gold that lay glittering in the riverbeds, was gone. What remained was locked deep within the earth, trapped in ancient river gravels buried under entire mountainsides, or embedded in veins of quartz that ran through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada. To get to this gold required not a shovel, but a corporation. Hydraulic mining and hard rock quartz mining were not the work of individuals. They required enormous capital investment to build the dams, flumes, and heavy machinery. They required organized companies, engineers, and paid laborers working for a daily wage. The hunt for gold was no longer an adventure. It had become a heavily industrialized, dangerous, and often low-paying job. The dream of striking it rich with a lucky find had faded, replaced by the grim reality of wage labor. For the original 49ers, the rush, in its truest sense, was over. And so, the question arose for the hundreds of thousands of men who had staked everything on this golden gamble. What now? For many, the answer was to go home. They left California with empty pockets and heavy hearts, their dreams turned to dust. Some were too ashamed to face their families with nothing to show for their years of hardship. Others had simply had enough of the violence, the sickness, and the back-breaking labor. And many, of course, never left at all. They lay in unmarked graves on the hillsides above the mining camps, their stories ending in the very land they had hoped would save them. But a great many stayed. They were the ones who had survived, the ones who had seen the dream of gold for what it was, and were now pragmatic enough to find a new one. They looked around and saw that California's true wealth was not just the yellow metal in its rivers, but the rich soil in its valleys, the endless timber in its forests, and the boundless opportunities in its growing towns. The same energy that had been poured into the frantic search for gold was now redirected into building a new world. These former miners became the farmers, the ranchers, the merchants, and the tradesmen who formed the bedrock of a new society. They laid out the farms that would one day make California the breadbasket of the nation. They built the sawmills, the blacksmith shops, and the general stores in towns like Sacramento and Stockton. They took the raw, chaotic energy of the gold rush and began to forge it into a permanent, civilized state. This transformation was astonishingly fast. Before the gold rush, in 1848, California was a sparsely populated territory with fewer than 15,000 non-native people. By 1852, there were nearly 250,000. By the end of the decade, there were almost 400,000. This population bomb forced the hand of the United States government. The issue of California's future became a national crisis, deeply entangled with the toxic politics of slavery. In a desperate attempt to maintain the fragile balance of power in the nation, Congress admitted California to the Union as a free state in 1850, as part of a grand, temporary fix known as the Compromise of 1850. In just 2 years, the gold rush had turned a remote territory into the 31st state, dragging the center of American gravity decisively westward. The impact of this new state, and the incredible wealth it produced, was felt across the country and around the world. In the first decade of the rush alone, more than 750,000 pounds of gold were extracted from the earth, worth billions in today's money. This massive influx of capital helped fuel the Industrial Revolution on the East Coast, financed the construction of transcontinental railroads, and firmly established the United States as a global economic power. A decade later, this immense wealth would prove critical in funding the Union's vast war machine during the Civil War, helping to preserve the very nation that California had so recently joined. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the gold rush was not the gold itself, but the idea it created. The event burned a powerful myth into the global consciousness, the myth of California. It became more than just a place on a map. It became a destination for dreamers, a symbol of reinvention. It was the place you went to escape your past, to take a monumental risk, and to transform your destiny overnight. It was the idea that the future was always brighter, just over the next hill. This powerful idea, this California Dream never really went away. It echoed a century later in the hopeful actors and writers who flocked to Hollywood, and it echoes today in the ambitious engineers and entrepreneurs who journey to Silicon Valley. The gold rush established a culture of risk-taking, innovation, and relentless optimism that still defines the character of the state. The 49ers came searching for a treasure they could hold in their hands, but the lasting treasure they created was a dream that could be held in the heart. The gold rush was more than a search for treasure. It was a human tide that swept across a continent, carrying dreams of incredible wealth and nightmares of profound loss. It began as a secret whispered by a carpenter and became a global phenomenon that drew hundreds of thousands of people to a remote corner of the world, all of them chasing the same, simple, and powerful dream. They endured unimaginable hardships to get there, crossing oceans and deserts, burying their friends and family along the way. They arrived to find a life of brutal, back-breaking labor, where the cost of survival often consumed every speck of gold they could find. They lived in a world of mud, whiskey, and loneliness, a world where fortunes were made not by the many who toiled in the dirt, but by the few who sold them their supplies. It built a state on foundations of both glittering gold and deep injustice, its prosperity tragically fertilized by the destruction of native cultures and the exploitation of foreign miners. It scarred the landscape with a ferocity that is still visible today. And yet, through all the chaos and the cruelty, it forged a new society with a speed never before seen in history, accelerating the course of a nation and creating a powerful, enduring myth. It left behind a legacy that is woven into the very fabric of America. The Great Rush is long over. The camps are ghost towns, their wooden shacks slowly collapsing back into the earth. The shouts of the miners, in a dozen different languages, have faded into the wind. The rivers, once choked with mud, now run clear again. But the stories remain. They are embedded in the land itself, waiting to be heard in the quiet murmur of the waters they once scoured for gold. If you found value in these stories and enjoyed this journey into the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to History for Sleepyheads. In a world of fast-paced content, your support for this quieter style of storytelling means everything. It truly helps this channel grow, and allows me to bring more of these important histories to life for you. And now for my final question to you, what piece of history should we explore next in our sleepy way? Is there a forgotten event, a fascinating figure, or a quiet corner of the past you've always been curious about? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. I read every single one, and the best ideas often become our next adventure together. Thank you for spending your time here. I hope this story has given you something to reflect on. Until next time, sleep well.